Hi everyone! Today we'll create an extremely beautiful Tkinter application, and no, I'm not confused, I really mean Tkinter. Even though it is notorious for not being beautiful, today we will force it. Now, another cool thing on the menu is we will connect an SQLite database to our application, which will make it much more sophisticated and yet 100% beginner friendly. And we will begin by downloading the starter files of this project, which you can of course find on my GitHub account, and the link is in the description. Now, inside those files, you will find 2 different logos. You will also find 1 database file as well as 2 TrueType font files. Now, in addition, you can also access the wireframe of this project, which is basically a rough estimate of how our application will look like. Now, in my case, this would be frame number 1 and this would be frame number 2. And then last but not least, we also have our Python file, which we will access with our favorite IDE or text editor, in my case, Sublime. And we can see that this file contains only the most basic commands to run a Tkinter application. So first, we import Tkinter as tk. Then we initialize a window object and we call it root. And then lastly, we are calling the main loop method, which basically displays our window up until we click on the exit button. Cool? Now let's quickly see everything in action. And for this, we will need a terminal. In my case, I'm using Anaconda. Now, if you're not sure how or why I'm using Anaconda, please check out my awesome tutorial on the topic, which will get you up to speed. And this is really good, especially if you're new to this. Now, the first thing we'll do is we will activate our working environment. In my case, it is called env39. Next, we will navigate to the project folder. So let's go ahead and copy this path and let's paste it back in our terminal following a cd command, as in change. Sorry, my cat just jumped. Mia! Come on! Now, once we have removed our cat from the table, we will press enter. And beautiful, we are inside the project folder. Now from here, we will run our application with Python recipe picker.py, which is the name of our Python file, and we will then press enter. Once we do so, we have an empty Tkinter window popping at the very top left of our screen. And only after we click on the exit button, this application collapses. Awesome. Now let's make a few basic adjustments to this window object. Now the first thing I'd like to do is I would like to give it a title. So we will type root.title, where we can specify a string of our choice. In my case, I'm going to go for recipe picker. Next, let's make sure we are displaying our application at the very center of the screen and not at the top left corner. To do so, we will type root and we will call the eval method on it. Now, the eval method allows us to write commands in another programming language called TCL. Luckily, TCL is very simple and it goes as follows. We will open a set of quotes where we will type tk, as in Tkinter, followed by a double colon, which allows us to fetch the place window method. Next, we will specify a dot, which represents the top level window, and we will place it at the center. Now, if we save everything and we run this code, we will simply press on the up arrow, which will fetch our most recent command, and we will hit enter. Beautiful! Our application pops at the center of the screen, and we can see the beginning of the title, which is not exactly what we're aiming for, because we'd like to see the entire title, right? We would like this window to be much bigger. So let's take care of that. Now, one way we can do this is by creating something called a frame widget, where its main purpose is to group all kinds of elements together. So we can imagine frames as different pages in the same application. So let's go ahead and create our very first frame with tk.frame with a capital F, where the first argument would be the root window. The next argument would be the width, which we will set to 500 pixels. Next, we will set the height to 600. And if we're already here, we might as well set the background color as well. That's why we will type BG and we will set it to a hashtag 3D6466, which should result in a teal color if I didn't mess anything up. Now let's go ahead and assign this expression to frame1. And we will also need to call the grid method on this frame in order to place it on the page.
So let's go ahead and type frame1.grid, and we will place it at row 0 and at column 0.
Now I know that these two values are the default values, but here's the thing about Tkinter. We still need to specify them, otherwise we might get unexpected results. That's just Tkinter, it is what it is. Now let's go ahead and save everything and let's see if it worked. Beautiful! Our window is much bigger now and I didn't mess up the teal color. Awesome. Now the only problem is, because I've zoomed in a lot on my end, just so you guys can see the text much larger, my window is now overhanging from the bottom of the screen. So just for the sake of this tutorial, I'm gonna slightly revise the logic behind my centering command, and you don't need to do this on your end. This is just something I'll do for myself. Now, I have a feeling that some of you guys will find it very useful, so let's quickly go over these commands. So in the first line of code, we are pulling the total width of the screen and we are dividing it by 2, which will place our window at the center. Next, we are pulling the total height of the screen and we multiply it by 0.1, which will place our window 10% away from the top edge. And then lastly, I am calling the geometry method to set the size of the window as well as its location, which we have generated from the above variables. That's it. Now, the reason why I don't want you to use those 3 lines of code is not because there's 3 of them as opposed to this one above, but in general, this is not the best approach. If you're curious why, please leave me a comment below or just keep watching. You will see why. Now let's save everything and let's give it a quick run. Let's make sure that it works as expected. Awesome. 10% away from the top edge and right at the center of the screen. Well, slightly to the right, but that's okay. Cool. Now let's fill our empty frame with some widgets, and we will begin with a logo. Now the logo is an image, and in order to display images, we will need to use an image library called pillow. So from pill, as in pillow, we will import image tk with a capital I and a capital T. Very important. Then we will scroll below and we will load one of our logos with image tk.photo image in camo case once again, where we will set the file attribute to assets/r recipe underscore logo.png, which is one of our logos. Now, in particular, I'm talking about this guy. Awesome. Now let's go ahead and assign this expression to logo image. And now once we have a Tkinter image loaded, we can then convert it into a widget. Now Tkinter doesn't really have a special widget for images, so instead we are using the tk.label widget, once again with a capital L. Now the first argument we specify here would be the location where we'd like to place this widget. In our case, frame 1, not the root window. Now the next argument would be the image itself, and in our case, that's logo image. And yes, it is very important for it to be a Tkinter image. Cool. Now let's go ahead and assign this expression to logo widget, just so we make a distinction between the two. Now, in the next line of code, we will do something absolutely ridiculous that we cannot get away with. Tkinter kind of forces us to do so. So we will access the image attribute of our logo widget by typing logo widget.image, and we will set it once again to logo underscore image. And yes, I know we've done it above here, but Tkinter really insists on us to do this again. And we're kind of hostage here, so let's just do it. Now, if we don't do this, once again, we will get very unexpected results and Tkinter will go buggy on us. So yeah, don't mess with Tkinter. Cool. Now, the last thing left to do is to call the pack method on this logo widget. So we will type logo widget once again .pack. And beautiful. Now, if we save everything and we run this code, we should see our logo on the window. Ha! Okay, well, the logo is here, but where's our background color? Let's see if we can fix it very quickly. Let's go back to our code, and we will simply add a BG attribute to our label widget. Actually, I'll move it a bit away because my face is about to cover it. Okay, and we will once again set it to the exact same teal color as our background. Hopefully this will do the trick. Let's save everything. Let's give it a run. Ha!
Okay, so our logo now has a background color, but not the rest of our window. How are we supposed to fix it? One way we can solve it is to prevent the child label element from modifying the parent frame element. And we can do this with the preprocess method. So we will type frame1.pack_propagate, and we will set it to false. Let's go ahead and save this file. Let's rerun it. And not only did we fix all our background issues, but we have also centered our logo and the rest of the widgets on the page. Awesome! Now let's move on. So first, let's store our background color in a special variable called bgColor. That's because we are about to repeat this background color multiple times across our application, and it's not an easy string to remember, okay? So let's just assign it. Now we will replace every instance of 3D6466 with bgColor. We'll do this in both places. Beautiful. And now we can move on with our instructions widget. Now, in order to place some text inside our window, we will need to use the tk.label widget once again. And we will once again place it inside frame 1. But instead of specifying an image, this time we will specify some text. And in my case, I will set it to ready for your random recipe, ? And actually, let's span it across multiple lines of code, because I have a feeling my head will block half of it, so let's take care of it in advance. Now, let's go ahead and set the background color to bgColor, and we'll also set the foreground color as an FG, or the text color to white. Easy peasy. Now, let's quickly talk about fonts. The main purpose of Tkinter is to be consistent across different operating systems. So it doesn't matter if you use Linux, Windows, or Mac, your application will look exactly the same. That's why Tkinter has a special list of fonts it works with. And all of them are equally ugly, okay? Now, unfortunately, if you are not using Windows, you are limited to this set of fonts only, okay? So what we will do is we will first design this application with those generic Tkinter fonts, and at the very end of this video, I will show you how to use custom fonts instead. And again, this will only work for Windows, so I apologize in advance, okay? Now, at first, we will set this font to a tuple of tk menu font, and we will also give it the size of 14. Now, the last thing left to do is to call the pack method on this widget to organize it nicely inside the frame, and we'll actually call the pack method on the rest of our widgets as well, with the exclusion of our frames where we called the grid method. So these are just two alternatives. Cool. Now let's save everything and let's give it a run. Beautiful! Here's our label widgets, our instructions for this application. Now let's go ahead and add the last widget of this page, which is the button. And this time we will create a tk.button widget and we will place it inside frame 1. We will also give it the text of shuffle, and we will set its font to a tuple of tk heading font in the size of 20. Awesome. Now this time we will go for a slightly darker teal background, so we will set bg to #28393a. Hopefully. These are hard to remember, guys. Now next we will set the foreground color to white once again. And now since this time we are dealing with a much more interactable widget, it makes a lot of sense to change the cursor to a pointing hand every time we hover above this button. To do so, we will type cursor equals hand 2. Now, in addition, we can also make it much more interactable than this. We will simply set an active background color, and we will set it to a very light teal color, which is much easier to remember. So this goes by #BAD2. I bet you Santa is not very impressed with this one. Now, because it's a very light teal, we will also need to change the font color. So let's change the active foreground color to black, just so we have some contrast. Now, the last argument we need to specify here would be the command. Now the command is basically a function that runs every time we press on this button. Let's call it load frame 2. We haven't defined it yet, but I already know we're going to call it that way. So what happens if we leave this function as is? Let's test it. So let's call the pack method on this button, and let's see what happens if we create this load frame function at the very top of our code. So we will use the def keyword, we will paste this function name, and we will then print hello Maria. And again, this is just for testing purposes. Now let's run this code. Cool, so we have our button here, but we didn't really press on it, and we already see our message printed in the terminal. What? Okay, but what if we press on the shuffle button? Nothing happens. So it looks like if we just specify the function name, it's not really attached to a click on the button event. So let's quickly fix it. And the way to do so is to add an anonymous function called lambda right in front of our load frame 2 function. Okay, and this colon is also very important. And now, if we save everything and we run this code, we no longer see this message printed in our terminal. So it's already a good start. Let's click on the shuffle button. Beautiful, here's our message. And as many times as we click on the shuffle button, our message is printed again and again. Awesome. Now, the only thing left to do with this frame is to add a bit of margin or padding in between those two elements, because we have so much room on the page and we're not, and we're cluttering them up instead of allowing them some space. So let's go back to our code, and the place where we specify some margins or padding is inside the pack method, because pack is organizing those elements inside the frame. So inside pack, we will type patty, as in padding Y, I believe, and we will set it to 20. That's it. Let's save it. Let's see if it worked. Beautiful! We have a really nice gap in between our elements now. So that's it. We are done with frame 1, and we can finally continue with frame 2. So back in our code, let's do some organizing first. Now, since we have added this load frame 2 function, it kind of makes sense to wrap our frame 1 widgets in their very own function as well. That's why right above, we will define load frame 1. Beautiful. Next, we will copy our entire list of widgets, starting from the logo and down to the very button. Let's cut it and let's paste it inside our new function. We will also fix this indentation. And another thing, which I almost forgot, is to copy our pack propagate method as well. Actually cut it entirely and paste it at the very top of our function. Beautiful. And now frame 1 is officially complete. And now we can move on with frame 2. Now the first thing we'll do in regards to frame 2 is defining it or initializing it, because we haven't done it yet. So we will scroll down, we will copy our frame 1 command, which my head blocks as per tradition. We will paste it below and we'll slightly adjust it. So frame 1 turns to frame 2, and we will also delete this width and height specification, because we would like this frame to adjust to the size of its elements. Why? Because we will be fetching different recipes time and again. And those recipes, they have different lengths of title and they have different number of ingredients. Okay, that's why we don't want to limit the size of our frame. And actually, if you're curious, that's exactly why I'm not a big fan of this geometry method approach. We are limiting the size of our window. So back to frame 2, there are two approaches of putting it on the grid. So we can either copy this line of code, that's the lazy approach, we can paste it below and we can adjust frame 1 to frame 2, and that's it. But the elegant approach, the not so lazy approach, is to wrap them inside a for loop. Okay, so let's just scroll a bit lower, and for frame in a tuple of frame 1 and frame 2, we will then call the grid method on the iteration variable of frame. There you go. We can then get rid of those two lines of code from above. Beautiful. It looks much more elegant. For some people, it's important. Now, lastly, before we are trying to run this code, please do not forget to call the load frame 1 function. Otherwise, we're not going to have any elements on the page. Okay, let's save everything and let's give it a run. Beautiful. Okay, so our application looks good. What happens when we press on the shuffle button? Awesome. So we didn't mess up anything in our code, and now it's much, much more organized. So now let's quickly take a look in the wireframe before we move on. And actually, if you're curious, this is my pancakes recipe. If you follow those ingredients, your pancakes would be mwah, amazing, I guarantee. Now, what we have here is we have a logo widget and we have a button widget, which we are very familiar with. We can just copy and paste them and slightly adjust them. But the biggest problem here is how exactly do we fetch the title and the list of ingredients from our database? So let's focus on that first. To do this, we will first import SQLite 3, and we will then define a brand new function called fetch_db, as in fetch from database. Now, first things first, we will need to establish a connection with our database file, which you can find inside the starter files in the data folder, and there you go, that's recipes.db. So to establish this connection, we will type connection equals SQLite3.connect, to which we will pass the path or data/recipes.db. Beautiful. Now, if you're not sure how to work with SQLite, I have an amazing tutorial on the topic. And I even have a follow-up tutorial showing you how you can web scrape your own databases with the help of SQLite and Mechanical Soup, which is exactly what I've done to create this database, okay? Now, I'm assuming that you watched both. So if you're looking for a detailed explanation, please check out those tutorials. If you're looking for a quick explanation, that's exactly what you're gonna get here. Now, once we have established a connection with our database, we will then need to create something called a cursor object. So we'll do this with cursor equals connection.cursor. Beautiful. And now we can call SQL commands on this cursor. So we will type cursor.execute, and inside those round brackets, we can then pass commands in SQL, which is another language that is meant to communicate with databases. Now, before we can pass any type of SQL commands, we will need to understand the structure of our database first. And it goes as follows. Each recipe is stored in a separate table. The title of the recipe is stored as the name of the table, and each of the ingredients is stored as a row or a record. This, while the columns or fields of our database are ID at index 0, which is basically a self-incrementing primary key, which we are not going to use, so we simply don't care about it. Okay? And right after, we have the name of the ingredients at index 1, we have the quantity of the ingredients at index 2, and lastly, we have the unit of measure of the ingredients at index 3. And this pretty much summarizes the entire architecture of our database. Now, the biggest challenge is that usually, when we execute SQL commands, we need to know the name of the table we are trying to access in advance. In our case, it's a bit problematic because we are looking to randomly access different tables time and again. But luckily, there exists a way to fetch all the table names of a database and pull them into our Python file. Now, is this the best approach? Probably not, because we are wasting lots of resources. A better approach would be preloading all our table names into a CSV file, and then we can access one record at a time, instead of accessing all the table names at once. So you must be wondering, how come we're using a different approach for this? Well, what I'm about to show you is extremely simple, and not a lot of people know how to do this, so it makes us very special. And the SQL command to select all the table names of a database is select all from SQLite_schema where type equals a string of table. And we will finish this expression with a semicolon because SQL is no Python. Now, once we have selected everything we need to select, we will also need to fetch it. That's why we will type cursor.fetch all and an empty set of round brackets. We will now assign this expression to all_tables. And let's print the very first recipe name with print all tables in the index of 0. Awesome. Now, the last thing we'll need to do here inside this fetch database function, at least for now, is to terminate this connection which we have established earlier. That's why we will type connection.close. That's it. Now let's go ahead and call this fetch database function within our loadFrame2 function. So let's just paste it and let's get rid of the print statement from below because we have a different way of checking if things work. Let's save everything. Let's press on shuffle. Ha! Look at this. We are fetching the very first recipe name, which is a Southwestern beef brisket. 100,000. Awesome. Now let's add a bit of randomness, just so we can fetch different recipes time and again. Now we will use NumPy for our randomness. So from NumPy, we will import random. And then right below our fetch all command, we will create a new variable called idx as in index, and we will assign it to random.randint as in random integer. And we would like this integer to be anywhere between 0 and the length of our all tables, list -1. And that's because the length function starts counting from 1, while everything else starts counting from 0. So we need to accommodate that with a -1 in the very end. And then once we are generating this random integer, we can now print all tables in the index of idx instead. And this will result in different recipes time and again. So let's save everything. Awesome. Let's press on shuffle. We have a fish burgers with fresh something. We'll press shuffle again. We have Creolis Tele. Holy smokes. Orange marmalade. I can pronounce that. Awesome. So now let's go ahead and access the ingredients of those tables. So first, we will create a new variable called table name, which is actually given to us by index 1 of our print statement, because index 0 just keeps storing the type of table. We can verify that right above. So what we're actually looking for would be index 1. So let's go back to our code, and then our table name is given to us by all tables in the random index of idx in the field of 1. Beautiful. Now, once we have fetched the table name, we can actually select all the ingredients from this table with cursor.execute, to which we will pass the SQL command of select all from space, to which we will concatenate the table name as well as a semicolon. Very important. And actually, let's make it consistent. Let's use a double quote for that. Sorry. Now, once we have selected all those beautiful values, we will also fetch them, and we will store them as ingredients, which we will assign to cursor fetch all, of course. Then we will go ahead and print those ingredients along with the table name, just to make sure that everything works. Let's save everything and let's give it a quick run. Let's shuffle. Ha, look at that. So everything works, but before we can display those messy records inside frame 2, we will need to slightly pre-process them. So what do I mean? We will basically need to get rid of those 6 digits in the end of the title of our recipe, and we will also need to add some spaces in between the words. In terms of the ingredients, we will convert them into a grammatically accurate string so we can then easily pull them into label widgets. So what do I mean? Instead of having separate values for milk, 2, and tablespoons, we will convert it into a string of 2 tablespoons of milk. Okay? Makes a lot of sense. So let's go back to our code and do just that. So let's do the following. Let's get rid of those 2 print statements and let's return the table name as well as the ingredients. And actually, if we call this a table name, we might as well call this table records. It's a bit more accurate. And sure, once we convert those records into a nice string, we can then call it ingredients. But up until then, these are just a bunch of messy records. So now let's go ahead and copy this name, and we will replace ingredients in our return statement as well. And once we have a nice return statement, we can then move on with defining a brand new function called preprocess, which of course takes in the table name as well as the table records as input. Now, the first thing we'll do is we will slice off the numeric extension of our title. So we will type table name. We will open a set of square brackets where we will select all the characters up until the character at index -6, which is essentially removing the last 6 characters of our string. We can then assign this to title And another thing we'll need to do is we will need to add some spaces in between the words. Now, in our case, it's extremely easy because each of our words starts with a capital letter. So the logic behind the next commands would be detecting those capital letters, and in case we find them, we will then concatenate a space right in front of them. Now, there are a few ways of doing so, but my favorite way is using a list comprehension, which is basically a fancy one-liner for loop. So for our list comprehension, we will need a set of square brackets, where I will explain all the commands as we go. So we begin with char if char is lower, which means that if our character is lowercase, we do not touch it, we leave it as is. However, if it is not the case, we will need an else clause. So if our character is uppercase, we will then concatenate a space character right in front of this character. Easy peasy. Now, the last thing we will specify here is we would like to do this for all the characters in title. Beautiful. Now, this is self-explanatory, I believe. Now we can then go ahead and reassign it back to title. Beautiful. But a funny thing will happen if we will try to print this title. So let me show you. Let's print it and we'll then discuss the results. Now, before we can do anything, we'll need to call this preprocess function. So let's just copy it. Let's scroll to load frame 2. Let's paste it underneath our fetch database function. Now, since fetch database now has a bunch of return values, we will simply copy those variable names, actually those arguments, and we will assign them to fetch database. Okay? Because you remember, fetch database returns the table name and the table records, and then we are just pre-processing them inside the next function. Cool? Now let's save everything and let's give it a run. And each of our characters is in a separate item of a list, which is not what we're looking for. We would like to join them. So let's go back to our code and we'll do just that. Actually, let's close this Tkinter app. Cool. So we will simply use the join method. So we will specify an empty string followed by .join, and we will wrap our entire list comprehension in a set of round brackets. Beautiful. Once we do so, we can then save everything and let's check if it worked. Let's press shuffle. Ha! Okay, much better. And now that our title is perfect, we can take care of the ingredients. So let's iterate over the list of records with for I in table records. And if you guys remember, the very first field was the ID, which we don't care about, so we just skip it. Right after, we have the name, which is given to us by I at index 1. Right after, we have the quantity, or QTY, which is given by I at index 2. And lastly, we have the unit, which is given by I at index 3. Awesome. Now let's go ahead and assemble these into something along the lines of 2 cups of sugar. Now 2 is, of course, the quantity, so we start with QTY, and we will append a space character to it because we have a space. Next, we have the cups, which is obviously the unit, so we will concatenate unit, followed by a string of space, and lastly, we have sugar, which is the name, so we will just type name. And this is exactly how our ingredient strings will look like. So what we'll do is we will first create an empty list right before our for loop, and we will call it ingredients. We will then assign it to an empty set of square brackets. So within the body of the for loop, we can then append our fancy string into this list. So we will type ingredients.append, and we will copy this line of code from below and paste it inside those round brackets, which my head blocks. Traditionally. Now, in the very end of this for loop, actually outside of this for loop, we will also print ingredients just to double check that everything looks good and it grammatically makes sense. So now let's save everything and let's test it. Let's see how it looks like. Okay, we'll press on the shuffle button. Okay, so we have 2 of garlic clove, we have 8 ounces of lamb, we have 2 tablespoons of butter. That seems very logical. Awesome. And now we can finally move on with populating our second frame. And first we will finish our preprocess function by deleting those print statements, and we will return the title as well as the ingredients. We will then copy those variables, we will scroll down to load frame 2, and we will unpack our preprocess function into those variables, right? Because Right now we are returning some values. Now, in order to properly switch between frames, we will need to start each frame with a tkraise method. Now, what this method does is it stacks one frame above the other so that the most relevant frame would be on top and the least relevant frame would be below it. And we will need to repeat this command across both our frames. So let's just copy it. Let's paste it inside frame 1 and let's adjust frame 2 to frame 1. Beautiful. Next, we can finally place our widgets on the page. Now, the first widget would be the logo, so we'll just copy it from frame 1 and we will slightly adjust it. Okay, so let's paste it inside frame 2. Let's fix the indentation of our comment. It's not very important, but I am picky. And the first change would be a different photo. So we will load our recipe logo bottom this time. And the second change would be placing this widget inside frame 2 rather than frame 1. And then lastly, we will add a bit of padding. So patty equals 20. That's all. Next, we have our title, which is a label widget. So we will copy it once again from the previous frame. We'll paste it below, fix the indentation, of course, actually fix it multiple times. Now it looks about right. So first we will display it inside frame 2. Then we will assign the text to our title. Yeah, and we'll get rid of this space just so everything looks consistent. And we will switch the font from TK menu font to TK heading font, because after all, it's a title, so it's very important. We will then also increase the size to 20. And maybe we'll just add a bit of padding. So let's go for patty equals 25. Whatever. We'll see if it looks good. If not, we will change it. Now, right after this, we have our labels. And to display our labels, we will first need a for loop because there's a bunch of them. So we will type for I in ingredients. And for each of our ingredient strings, we will create its own label. Fix the indentation, of course. Place them inside frame 2, of course. We will switch the text to I, which is each of our ingredients one at a time. Now, another thing we'll do is we will reduce the size of this font to 12, and that's it. I don't think I want to add any padding at this point of time. We'll just leave it as is. And then we are left with the last widget on the page, which is the back button. So once again, we will copy. I love frame 2 because it's all about copy and paste, okay? All the hard work was done earlier. Okay, so we will make sure that we are out of the for loop. We don't want to repeat this button time and again. We will fix the indentation. Okay, let's double check that it's not within the for loop. Awesome, it is not within the for loop. Now, we would like to display this button inside frame 2, and we would like the text to be back, so we can go back to frame 1. Now, we will also slightly adjust the heading font to a size of 18, because it's not very important, and we need some room for our ingredients. And the last thing we will need to adjust here is instead of loading frame 2, we will need to load frame 1 because the back button gets us back to the first frame. Okay, now everything looks good. Let's save it. And hopefully it worked. So let's run our code. So far, so good. Let's press on shuffle. Okay, wow, look at that. It looks amazing. So does it mean we are done? Let's verify that. Let's go back. And we are not done. So what's going on here? Now, since we are creating brand new widgets inside our load frame functions, each time we call them, we just keep adding and adding and adding new widgets to the frame until everything looks like a huge mess. So before we add new widgets, we need to find a way of disposing of the old ones. One way we can solve this is by defining a brand new function called clear widgets. And this function will take in one parameter, which would be the frame. We will then select all the widgets of this frame with for widget in frame.winfo, as in window info underscore children, as in the widget children of our frame parent. Now, once we have selected all our widgets one at a time, we will then type widget and we will call the destroy method on them. So now that we've defined this function, we will also need to call it. So let's go ahead and copy this function definition. We will then scroll all the way down to our load frame 1 function. we will paste it at the very, very top, and we will call it on frame 2. Because once we are inside frame 1, this is the perfect opportunity to clear frame 2. Now we will do the exact same thing with load frame 2. So let's scroll below. Let's paste clear widgets at the very, very top, and we will call it on frame 1 this time. Now let's save everything. Let's give it a run. Let's press shuffle. Okay, 2 problems, and one of them is only on my end. So the first problem is my window doesn't adjust to the size of the elements on a page. Okay, I need to do this manually. And this is just because I'm using the geometry method instead of the eval method, which I'll turn off right away. Now, another problem is those white annoying corners. So let's go back to our code and let's turn them off. So it's the perfect opportunity to comment out our geometry method and to comment in the eval method. And now the code on my end is 100% match to the code on your end. Now the way to get rid of the annoying white corners is to simply add a sticky attribute inside our grid method and to set it to north, east, south, west. That's it. And that way we are asking our frame to be expanded or to stick to all 4 corners of our window. Now let's save this code and let's give it a run. Okay, now I'm gonna have to manually move my window away, and let's press on shuffle. Okay, so far so good, but the window didn't really expand, so we wouldn't see those white corners anyways. Let's just keep shuffling until the window expands. Okay. Beautiful! So our window expanded and we do not see those annoying white corners. Awesome! So let's keep testing just in case. Yep, everything looks good. Awesome. Now, one thing we should keep in mind that inside my wireframe, the list of ingredients, it had a nice darker background. So let's do it. So we will navigate to our load frame 2 function. We will find our list of ingredients and we will set their background color to a hashtag 28393A, which is the exact same color as our button. Now, in addition, if we'd like this background color to expand until the full width of our screen, we will also specify the fill equals both argument inside our pack method. Now let's save everything and let's check if it worked. Let's press shuffle. Beautiful! Look at this awesome background behind our ingredients. So let's press back again, just in case. We'll keep testing it. Awesome! It looks great. Now, if you're using Linux or Mac, your application is complete, and you can officially distribute it across all operating systems. I'll actually show you exactly how to do this in the next few tutorials. However, if you're using Windows, I'm going to show you how to make this app much, much prettier by using custom fonts. Now keep in mind that once custom fonts are involved, this application will be much more difficult to distribute across all operating systems. Not impossible, but much more difficult, because you'll have to revise my logic in a certain way. So, for example, you can first of all check which operating system the user has, and based on that, you can determine whether to use custom fonts or not. So first of all, we will need some true type font files, which you can find in the fonts folder of our starter files, of course. There's Shanti Regular and there's Ubuntu Bold. Next, we will need some kind of a media library to load those files, and I find that it's very simple just to use Pyglet. That's why we will install it with conda install-c conda forge Pyglet, or pip install Pyglet if that's your choice. Beautiful, now I already have everything installed, so I obviously don't need to do this again. Next, we will import Pyglet, and we will then load both our fonts. To do so, we will type pyglet.font.add_file. That's it. And inside, we will just specify the path of our font with fonts/Ubuntu bold.ttf, and we'll do the exact same thing for Shanti. So let's just copy this line of code, let's paste it below, and we'll load Shanti Regular. Now, the fun part is replacing every instance of TK heading font with Ubuntu, and every instance of TK menu font with Shanti. Not Shanti Regular, Shanti, not Ubuntu Bold, but Ubuntu, okay? So let's just copy Ubuntu, and let's scroll down. Okay, TK menu font turns to Shanti. TK heading font turns to Ubuntu. And let's do this for all our widgets. Okay, let's save everything. Let's give it a run. Ah, I ran the wrong command. Oh no, okay, so let's press the up arrow twice, okay? Sorry, guys. Beautiful. Look at this amazing application, you guys. Oh my God, let's press shuffle. This is phenomenal. Let's press back. Let's keep testing it. I love it. It looks so good. Can you actually believe it's Tkinter? I still can't. I'm amazed. Now, thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial. And if you did, please give it a huge thumbs up and share it with the world. If you'd like to be extra awesome, you can always subscribe to my channel and turn on the notification bell. If you have anything to say or any questions, or just if you want to say hi, Maria, you can always leave me a comment. I read all of them, or at least vast majority of them. And yeah, I'll see you guys very soon in a brand new tutorial. So for now, bye-bye!